Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be talking about this recent report that was released just yesterday, talking about Canada being caught in a population trap. So this has been making a ton of headlines recently across various financial news sites, talking about this so-called population trap that Canada's in. And I gave this report a quick read, and it seemed to be filled with a lot of what you would probably call economic jargon. And it was just full of language that to me initially didn't really seem accessible to most people whose audience it was probably intended for. So I wanted to just take a bit of time to explain this report in more layman's terms and just go over what they're trying to say and also give my initial reaction to it. So, immigration policy in Canada over the last few months has become very, very controversial. Pretty much as soon as those annual figures got released and people saw just how high immigration was in 2023, that's when people started cluing in and realized just the sheer scale of things. Now, this point that they talk about here is really the main point of what they're trying to say in this article, which is the population trap, a situation where no increase in living standards is possible because the population is growing so fast that all available savings are needed to maintain the existing capital labor ratio. So, again, that's kind of just filled with a lot of economic jargon, and there's a few parts to that. So, one is the capital labor ratio. So, capital in this case, you can think of like anything that's used to produce income, right? So, for simplicity, let's just say there's a factory and the factory has tools and machinery in the factory. And then you also have the labor side of things, which would be the workers that go into the factory. So capital could also be, the land and the building of the factory itself. But for simplicity, let's just say it's the tools and the machinery within the factory. Now, generally in economics, you would correlate a higher capital to labor ratio with economic growth, and specifically economic growth on a per capita basis, because that would mean each worker within that factory has access to more tools, more machinery, which in theory will enable them to produce more things, right? They can sell more of whatever it is they're selling. They could be more productive, which results in them having higher incomes. And now they have a better living standard overall because of that. So that's the economic theory, right? And it's a simple example, but you can kind of extrapolate that out into any industry that you want and really across the entire economy. So obviously, with this rise in population growth, that would increase the labor side of the ratio. So they're saying that all savings are being used just to maintain this part of this ratio. So what is meant by savings in this case? Well, basically anything that is not currently invested, right? Something that's not currently trying to produce income, something that's not considered capital. So that's the general idea behind this statement, is that Canada is now at a point where the population growth is too high, where we have no ability to invest in the capital resources needed to make the new citizens of this country as productive as they need to be to increase this capital labor ratio, which is generally correlated with higher living standards. And higher living standards is something that we all want, right? So, really, nothing that wasn't already being talked about, right? It's kind of just a way of explaining things in a more economic sense and then just saying this is the first time in modern history that this has happened, which is bound to get some headlines. So now I'll read a little bit about what they're saying specifically. So Canada's population has increased by more than 1.2 million in 2023, an incredible number given that it followed a rebound of 825,000 in 2022 after the lockdown recession. These are staggering numbers when you consider that prior to this, you would have to go back to 1949 when Newfoundland joined the Federation to see our country's population increase by more than 600,000 in 1 year. So they give this chart, and this really highlights, how significant it was last year, increasing by this much, which is, truly unprecedented for Canada. So to put things into perspective, Canada's population growth in 2023 was 3.2%, 5 times higher than the OECD average. What's more is all 10 provinces were at least twice as fast as the OECD, ranging from 1.3% in Newfoundland to 4.3% in Alberta. And we can see Ontario here was 3.4% population growth. Our country's current population growth appears extreme relative to the absorptive capacity of the economy and the fact that our workforce is not aging faster than the OECD average. So that statement may be a little confusing initially. What does it mean by not aging faster than the OECD average? Basically, what they're saying is because of immigration and because of this rise, in the population, that's not being offset by an already aging population in Canada. Because there could be two alternating forces. The labor force could be growing with immigration, or it could also be shrinking with an aging population. So that's one counterpoint that maybe some economists would make to this report, saying it's possible that the aging of the population is offsetting this to some extent, which it is, but to a very small extent. And they're just making the point that there's nothing unusual about the aging of Canada's workforce. So nowhere is this absorption challenge more evident than in housing, where the supply deficit has reached new record of only one housing starts for every 4.2 people entering the working age population. So this is probably something that they specifically use to kind of measure, I guess, the accessibility of housing. And when you put at it in this kind of context, then yeah, it's going to look really bad. But it's really just another way of making the point that they're already saying, which is yeah, I mean, when you have this unprecedented rise in immigration, then pretty much every measure, any metric, any ratio that you can think of that uses immigration or changes in the labor force as one of its inputs, it's going to be thrown way off, right? So it's just kind of another way of highlighting the impact that this is going to have on housing specifically. And I mean, obviously, housing supply can't possibly increase at the same rate that Canada can increase immigration at. So, to address the situation, the federal government has recently introduced programs to increase housing supply. But to meet current demand and reduce shelter cost inflation, Canada would need to double its housing construction capacity to approximately 700,000 starts per year, an unattainable goal. Now, I was curious just to see what the actual numbers on this were. So, this is a website that shows housing starts in Canada on an annualized basis. We can go back even 25 years. And the highest that this ever was kind of around here. This is around 2021, which, if you guys recall in 2021, that's when pretty much everything was going up. Real estate, stocks, bonds, crypto, NFTs, everything was going up, right? And interest rates were extremely low at that point. So even at the height of all that hysteria, when interest rates were rock bottom and, you could get financing very cheaply, the highest housing starts got to an annualized rate was about 325,000, which is, about half of what they're saying it needs to be here. So obviously, yeah, 700,000 is just simply an unattainable goal. And I think something that kind of gets lost when you're discussing the whole housing crisis in Canada is the fact that there's just simply not enough construction workers to meet the demand that they're saying that there is. I mean, you can come out and say our goal is to hit this and this many housing starts and have this many housing units, but ultimately you're going to need the workers to support that. And you can get rid of all the other problems there, all right? You can get rid of the high interest rates, the development levies, the zoning laws, the NIMBYism, all that kind of stuff. You can get rid of all that, but you still simply do not have the construction workers necessary to meet the goal. In any case, our policymakers need to go beyond simply targeting housing supply and recognize that above a certain number, population growth is an impediment to our economic well being. The fact that real GDP per capita has been at a standstill for 6 years is a case in point. So here they're comparing real GDP per capita to the United States, which, some people may think that the United States is a fair comparison. I would argue that it's not for various reasons, and honestly, even just cultural reasons. I mean, you compare Canada as a culture to the US, and we're just simply not an entrepreneurial culture like they are in the US. We're not a risk-taking culture. Maybe you could argue that has something to do with the fact that, people, this, when it comes to the standard of living, people have to invest so much in just being able to afford a home that the idea of taking risks and doing something like starting a business is just, completely out there and not something accessible to most people. That's another point, but that's something you can make a whole video on. But I guess the point they're trying to make here is, yeah, Canada has been sufficiently lagging behind the US, and real GDP per capita has really been at a brutal standstill for many years, which in a developed country like Canada, this is something that you should see increasing. Some economists will be quick to point out that this stagnation reflects poor productivity. But why is our productivity record so bad? Could it be that our demographic ambitions are too high relative to the stock of capital available in this country? According to our calculations, Canada's capital stock per capita has collapsed to 1.5% in 2023. So again, they're just kind of making the same point here, right? Obviously, if you compare anything on a per capita basis to see what it was like last year, when you have this record population increase, all these metrics are just going to look thrown off. But it's still a valid point, I think. This means that our population is growing so fast that we do not have enough savings to stabilize our capital labor ratio and achieve an increase in GDP per capita. Simply put, Canada is in a population trap for the first time in modern history. More worrisome is the fact that this decline is not simply due to a lack of housing infrastructure. In fact, the private non residential capital stock to population ratio has been declining for several years and is currently no higher than it was in 2012, while it is at a record high in the US. So, what is this so called non residential capital stock per capita? Well, capital stock, as we said, is anything that can be invested to produce income. Residential housing is still included in this because essentially, by owning residential housing, you have an income producing asset. Even if you're not necessarily renting that out to someone, by living in it, you're saving on your own rent, which in this context is essentially the same thing as producing income because it's a cost that you don't have to pay. So the reason that they bring this up is because they're saying that for many years now, it hasn't just been housing that there's a shortage of. It's essentially all forms of income producing capital in Canada, which has huge implications for productivity going forward. And they're basically saying that this population trap isn't something that's new. It's actually been happening for a while now. Now, of course, their conclusion, if we go down to here, is that Canada is going to have to reduce the immigration rate. But let me know what you guys think. I want to hear from you on your thoughts on this situation. Do you think that these are valid concerns? Do you agree with what they're saying here? Or do you think maybe this whole situation is overblown? Let me know what you think. And yeah, thank you so much for listening, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.